If you've ever lost someone or something close to you, you've probably had some form of grief going on in your life. And you may have asked yourself, is this feeling ever going to quit? Is it ever going to go away? And I want to say yes, but also no. And let's talk about today on the Cultivating Calmness podcast. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Kaela. If you're new here, I am a grief and trauma therapist in Dublin, Ohio. My company is Teal Saguaro Wellness, and I talk a lot about trauma, grief, and more holistic functional living and how those things are incorporated into your life and how that can incorporate into the therapy you may or may not be doing. So grief has been a part of my life for many years, for as long as I can remember, essentially. If you are not aware, if you have not listened to other podcasts of mine, my mom died when I was 7, so it will be 31 years this year. We haven't met that date yet, but it'll be 31 years this year. So that grieving process has spanned over now 3 decades. And when I say it like that, that's a long time. I guess sometimes you realize it's been that long. Sometimes you don't realize things have been as long as they have. Some days it can feel like, it happened, semi-recently, and other times it feels so far away. So that question, does these feelings of grief that you may be having, and grief isn't just one feeling. It's pretty much all the feelings. It's all the feelings that you could possibly have for any number of reasons at any time, happen pretty much whenever. Now, when you're in the throes of grief, right? When you're in those first days, weeks, months, potentially years, although, we hope that the grief you're experiencing isn't as intense years following, but it can be. Grief is different for everybody. We can have, problematic grief and traumatic grief and, more like compounding grief where there's like multiple losses that you may be experiencing or facing. And all of those can change the way you think and change the way you feel and how maybe long you're experiencing those symptoms. But a lot of people who have experienced grief will tell you that it never really goes away. And I would say that that is true. But, in my experience, grief has, I'd say gotten better and just changed over time. So it doesn't ever fully go away. There are moments where I can have a conversation about my mom. I would say most often I can have conversations about my mom and be totally fine, right? No tears, no nothing, no like really big emotions or anything like that. And then there are times where, just trying to talk about it or say something can get me choked up and can, be a little hard. So those times are a lot fewer, like few and far between, but they do happen. And, they may happen today while I'm talking because, I haven't, fully planned out every little thing I'm going to say. So sometimes those memories and those things can come back as you're talking about somebody or as you're talking about something. And that's where I would say it's yes, but no, or yes and no. Grief just ebbs and flows. What I like to say with grief and what I've learned over time is that we don't want grief to be our whole life. If you imagine a bookshelf, I have this kind of little stand over here, and just imagine that was books. Imagine there was nothing on it, and grief was just one really large, like, dictionary book, okay? And we put that dictionary, huge book on the shelf, right? That's, like, right after you're experiencing this grief, right after something's happened. It feels really big. It feels really heavy, and it feels like it's the only thing on the shelf here. Um, and that's normal. But over time, what we want to do is we want to incorporate grief into our lives. So we don't want the grief to continue to be the only thing on our shelf. And some people who are or have experienced grief know this because they were forced into it, that you have to continue to live life. Like if you're a parent and you have kids, whether it was your spouse or another kid or another family member, right? You have to keep on going. You still have to wake up. You have to wake the kids up. You have to feed them, get them dressed, take them to school, do all their activities, get them to bed, and do it all over again the next day. So you're kind of forced into that, and your grief kind of sits in with that life, but it can still wreak havoc on your life. So what we like to see, and what I like to see, and the way I describe it, I'm a very visual person, so I love metaphors and analogies and ways I can help picture a problem or a solution or just whatever it is we're talking about. So picture this bookshelf here, and day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, we're filling up the bookshelf. Now this is a teeny tiny bookshelf, but just imagine your life is a wall, a big bookshelf. And every day, we're putting books on the shelf, we're filling in chapters, we're adding little knickknacks, maybe little plants, maybe little things you collect, pictures, things like that, until, one day you look at your shelf and it's full, right? Some books come and some books go, but that grief book, still the same size. It's still really heavy just as it was before. But now it doesn't seem to take up as much space as everything else on the shelf because you have incorporated it into your life. You've learned to live with the grief instead of the grief living with you and the grief kind of taking you over, which is what it can feel like, especially in the beginning. Now, I was a kid, so grief looked a little different for me, and it does for most kids. Over, other, adults who maybe like my dad, his grief may have looked a lot different than what my grief would have looked like. And that can confuse people. Grief can look very different for anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a kid or an adult. You're laughing instead of crying. You're crying instead of laughing. You're angry instead of happy. You're happy instead of angry. All these different, emotions and expectations that other people have based on their own experience and their own belief system. But, talking about how grief can look as you age and as you grow, away from those experiences, I think it just looks different. You know, um, for me, I was 7. So, there was going each year into a new grade. But when it first happened, I was in a private school, so pretty much everybody knew. Um, but it happened like right before I started a new school. So how many people actually knew? I don't know. Eventually they all knew, I think. But then I left private school and I went to public school where absolutely 0 people knew anything about my mom and what had happened to me. So that's a transition. Like that's different, right? When everybody knows something versus nobody knows something, there are those triggers. So for me, I didn't learn to make jokes or make light of or to be able to laugh about um, grief and death and like my mom dying until I was an adult, I would say. Even up into high school, if people made mom jokes, your mom, I would literally cry. Sometimes breaking down, and there's a joke with my husband who made that joke before he knew me, and I was crying and he was kind of left like, what happened? What did I say? And my friends, told him. So obviously that didn't keep me from marrying him. But, you know, that has grown over the years, right? So in high school, that would have been 10 years on. And it just hit differently, not having a mom and seeing people with their moms and being able to do things, that got easier and easier as time went on. But there were just moments that were hard. Um, in high school, we had a theater teacher, and I did theater in high school, and everybody called her mom. Everybody, even like new people would come in, they'd see all the like veteran, theater kids, and they'd all be calling her mom, and they would call her mom. And it took me a solid year to be willing to call her mom. I would not do it. I would not call her mom. I never called any of my friends' moms mom. My siblings did. My siblings would call their good friends' moms mom. They probably wouldn't have had a problem doing that, but for me, that felt like, maybe it was like a betrayal, or like, I can't call anybody else mom. I only have one of those. But now, right, that's not a problem for me. Now I can do that. No problem at all. So like, that's just how you grow with different aspects of your grief and what that might look like. There may be certain things you can say or can't say, things you can do or can't do based on maybe some of the grief that you are, experiencing, or that's still like, holding on to you, and really difficult to, move through. Therapy can help with that. That doesn't mean that it's all going to necessarily just go away. It could definitely make life and make those experiences easier. I say less heavy. So it feels lighter to be able to process that, and not carry that burden. As I got older, moving into, adulthood, there were times where I would think about, my mom not being there, really think about it. And I think it's always something that I recognize, and I know that she's not there and hasn't been there. But whether I'm in the moment where I recognize like, oh, she's not here, and man, I really wish she was here today. Um, that I would say isn't happening as often for me. And then I got into, being a mom, and now there are moments where I can recognize that, well, on top of being, a parent is just hard in general. Being a parent when you didn't have that role model, is hard. Now, it's not that I didn't have role models. I had both my grandparents, I had a great grandmother, and I had numerous aunts and uncles, and other, friends, parents, all who were really great role models and mother figures, and did a good job of, caretaking and helping and all of that. And so those were all good role model mothers. But I didn't have my mom, so becoming a parent and raising kids, and my kids around that age that I was when I was little, when my mom died. And so I'm now able to recognize that, feelings that come up, things that come up when they are acting a certain way or doing a certain thing. Now I've even like wondered, like, how much of that has to do with me not, having somebody there to show me. What does a mom do, when your kids are doing this or doing that? There's therapy world and all the stuff we know we're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And then there's the real life example you have when you're able to watch it and learn from it and emulate it or not emulate it. And it just, it hits different. You being able to see your siblings in a different way than when you did when you were little. So those are all things that maybe, that come up for me. But here, 30 years on, there are things that just remind me of her, remind me that, she's not here. Sometimes I can laugh and sometimes I cry. There are certain songs that I hear that are just those like crying songs. Sometimes you just need a good cry and then you're good to go, right? All right, we can go about our day. Sometimes when it comes to other people, dying. So, as like family members get older and, as you have friends or family that may be passing or dying or just big changes, that can bring up the grief that you've already experienced. It doesn't mean it's going to be as intense, but that grief can be triggered by the new grief that you are experiencing. So like, does the feeling of those feelings that come up with grief ever go away? I would say probably never fully, but they change, they morph. I I saw a little, snippet on social media a week or so ago. Somebody described grief as like glitter. And some people really love glitter. Uh, but I think most people like glitter to an extent, but they don't want glitter all over. And so grief is like, I think they said it was like a glitter bomb or something. You know, the glitter explodes and it's just everywhere. It's all over everything. And no matter how much you try to clean up, you're still going to have glitter everywhere. And then as you go along in your days, weeks, months, years, um, you know, you're going to continue to find that glitter. Even though you've washed the shirt, you're going to pick it up one day and there's going to be glitter on it and you're going to see it. And it's going to remind you of, oh yeah, that thing. You're going to go do the laundry and then you're going to have the glitter all up in it. And then the glitter's going to get on other things. And then you're going to see that glitter all over. Then it's going to be on the floor and you've swept it up and swept it up and swept it up. And you're still going to find glitter, years later. And you're going to remember the glitter came from that thing, you know? And so eventually the glitter, gets less and less. So you don't really see the glitter. But every once in a while, you'll see the glitter. Or maybe it's not the glitter from, the original glitter, but it's similar to the glitter. It's new glitter. And it brings up some of those reminders of that glitter. I also say, I like some analogies, and those visual connections. Grief is like a scar. At first it's like a big open gaping wound. And if we don't do something about it, it's just this festering open wound and we got to treat it, right? We got to do the things to help it to feel better. And that's different for everybody. But eventually what we want, right, we got to stitch up the wound, right? And so that it's stitched up and we got to put the stuff on it to make it heal and protect it and maybe be a little gentle. And there may be certain things we're not able to do because that scar is there. But eventually, the stitches or the staples or whatever are taken out. It's just a scar and it may be tender, but you're able to do those movements. You build back the muscle, you do the stuff. And down the road, it's just a scar. For the most part, right? You can touch it, poke it, move it, right? You don't feel it. But maybe every once in a while, you'll get a pain there, right? You'll hit it in just the right way, or you'll move your arm in just the right way. And you feel that little sensation. You're like, oh, I felt that. But it goes away, right? It doesn't stick. And, we still see the scar. It's still there. But we don't necessarily feel the intensity of the pain anymore, but we remember. We remember the pain. We remember where it came from and how it got there. Grief can be like that, right? It's that constant reminder of the thing that happened, the person that died. Because grief isn't always somebody that's died. Sometimes it's different things that you've lost, moving, changing jobs, being fired, divorce, loss of a friendship, anything like that can be grief. We can experience feelings of grief. And so that scar is just that reminder. And what we hope for you, for anybody, is that over time, the feelings and the intensity become less and less. It doesn't mean you love that person or that thing that happened it doesn't mean that thing that happened was any less important. It just means that you have learned to live with that grief now. It is incorporated into your life, and it's not necessarily standing outside of your life, and you've embraced it and it's part of you. But it does change the way you see the world. It changes the way you experience life. And, that's how grief can change over time. So that question, will I ever feel any better? Will this feeling ever go away? In short, probably not fully, but yes. Yes, the feelings of grief get better. They ease. Um, but they never fully go away. You're never necessarily going to be without grief, I would say, unless you're avoiding or burying it. Um, you're going to have something, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Just acknowledging it, that it exists. And there may still be healing needed and necessary in that grief and those things that you're experiencing, and there's nothing wrong with that either. And as you go through different phases in life, you may notice that grief feels a little more intense than at other times. So kind of like I described, changing schools or, getting married or having your own kids or having, like my other parent die, which has not happened. But someday it will. is going to bring up those feelings again. So for me, right, those transitions, those big life moments can bring up some of that grief because it's that recognition that that person isn't there anymore. And they should be there. We want them there. And that has its own difficulty as part of it. And that's normal, right? For grief to kind of ebb and flow and go up and down. And we hope it kind of stabilizes, right? And you may have these peaks every once in a while, peaks and valleys. But overall, right, we want it to stay kind of here in the middle. But at first, right, it's not. It's going to feel really big when we have these big ups and downs until it starts to even out as we go. So if you are somebody who is experiencing, grief and loss, if you want somebody to talk to, you're located in Ohio, I'd love to talk to you. My experience doesn't have to be like your experience. Everybody's experience is different, and I'm in no way comparing my experience to yours. But obviously, I have a little bit of understanding of what that can be like, and hopefully, we can help you work through that as well. So feel free to reach out to me if that is something you would like to talk through. I hope you had a wonderful day today. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you again next week.